Sight and Sacrament, Nature, Liturgy, and Earthly Life. Welcome to Sipa.
Thank you. Well, for having me here, thanks to Olga and the patriarch of the Orthodox Institute. It's probably going to be the most directly, one of the few papers directly related to Christian theology and the theological turn in phenomenology and its incorporation of Christian theological sources today. I'd like to speak a little bit about the significance of non-human nature with regard to religious experience and some of the resources for the discussion of the spiritual significance of nature within the Christian tradition. We begin with the work of Jean-Yves Lacoste, whose book Experience and the Absolute, and a fruitful trespassing of the limits between phenomenology and theology. The author's particularly strong claim is in relationship to the ordinary structures of lived experience. Phenomenology, according to Lacoste, attests to place, the location of the unfolding of our experience in our inherence amongst the beings with which we live. For Lacoste, Heidegger's multiple interpretation of place, both as unprimal world in being and time, and as the earthly dwelling place of mortals, as analyzed in Heidegger's later work on the thinking of the fourfold, are each in themselves correct and not in contradiction. Quote, the logic of inherence is sufficiently rich for it both to confer on us the status of not at home, as well as to provide us with a Mother Earth. But, Lacoste adds, neither in the unfolding of place as world or as earth can liturgy be included in the topological. The issue is that of encounter. Neither world nor earth attests to the experience or encounter of humanity with the absolute, or of God. This almost goes without saying with the at-bottom anxious and unheimlich world discussed in Being and Time. And though the divinities make an appearance within the thinking of the fourfold, Lacoste is quick to counter that. First, the Godhead remains veiled behind the divinities, which are its messengers. And, at best, this is a pagan insufficiency, for there is nothing native about the human experience of the divine. Liturgy, the place of prayer, while not overlooking the inescapable reality of the locatedness of human life, brackets without annulling both world and earth. That is to say, in order to counter facticity's interposition between humanity and God, liturgy subverts these horizons of experience. The relation of this subversive interpretation of liturgy to Lacoste's discussion of religious experience is circular, insofar as the insufficiency of the experiential in liturgy serves as the imminent data for this interpretation, whilst the interpretation of liturgy, quote, permits us to criticize every theory in which experience governs knowledge of God, or in which the relation of man to God reaches its culmination in the field of conscious experience, end quote. For on the one hand, if the horizons of lived and native experience are agnostic, if liturgy is, quote, absent from the dawn of experience, then it is hardly surprising that, quote, nothing could be described as the indisputable advent of God occurs in liturgy, end quote, rendering the happening of liturgy as a non-event. Without the transcendental horizons of experience, nothing, of course, appears. And this is simultaneously obvious to anyone within the Christian tradition, as, quoting Lacoste, the problem of Christian experience is the surprising non-realization, surprising because all is completed between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, of the eschaton. The time of this Christian experience can pass for being the end, but it is not the time when the outpouring of the Spirit will have instituted the modes of a definitive presence of man before man, of man before God, and when man would have at his disposal on earth the definitive and given homeland. Rather, it is the time of an experience always lived in the shadow of death, when the rule of negation or of sin has been anything but abolished, end quote. Liturgy must bracket experience and subvert it, or else it is judged by experience, and in that regard it fails to reply what it claims. At the same time, this means that the weakness, the insufficiency, the apparent death-like silence of earthly life regarding the divine, when compared to the promise of humanity's reconciliation with God, is not catastrophic. That neither facticity nor historicity enclose humanity is the lesson that liturgy teaches us. as to make clear, Lacoste is insistent that liturgy contests not just the interpretations of ordinary lived experience, but in fact contests the real, the pre-predicative experience that Husserl or Heidegger describes. So even the horizon of ontology is itself agnostic, if not entirely atheistic. A natural corollary to all of this is that the non-human earth, that which recedes and is protected by the manifestation of the world, is itself equally bracketed. Nature in general, both in our own non-liturgical corporeality and with regards to the basic non-human alterity of the rest of earthly being, is at best religiously ambivalent. What I wish to challenge here is none of the analyses Lacoste takes up from Heidegger, nor of his critique of religious experience insofar as it purports to provide evidence of an indisputable advent, nor indeed of the basic interposition accomplished by the operating world horizon between the negative and absolute. Rather, what is in question is the scope of liturgy, how far the time and the location of this bracketing extends. For it seems clear, though unannounced, that from Lacoste's various references to liturgical gestures and times of day, his appeal to liturgy is entirely literal. He means a gathering in a church, a specific rite, an accomplishment of well-defined sacramental operations. The import here will be made later on. As of now, it is simply not clear whether this particular act is itself the privileged accomplishing of our bracketing of the horizons of experience, whether it is only in this time and place that the encounter with the absolute can occur, nowhere else. Let us take up the words of St. Theophan the Recluse, a Russian saint of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Quote, experience frequently shows that the mind that has been dimmed becomes sober through contemplation of God's creation. One man in winter looked at the tree and stood up in front of his house. The power and influence of these visitations of God depend on the fact that they vividly and tangibly reveal the best and blissful order of life to a man's spirit that has been weakened, enervated, and exhausted. Quote, one must not take this reveals. Mere pages further on, Theophan admits that such experiences remain vague, indefinite, without interpretation, in the absence of preaching. This is, in fact, exactly in keeping with Lacoste, who contrasts uncertain and indefinite experience with knowledge, revealed teaching of the church. So what simply happens in Theophan's little account is that the vanity of the world is put into play and made manifest by means of distinction. This is not too far off from Heidegger's own depictions of the nothing and anxiety in his famous What is Metaphysics manifestation of its unhomelike character, which attests to the horizon of being. There is, at first glance, nothing liturgical about this. We are left in the same position as Lacoste in his examination of Heidegger. We remain within the native horizons of experience, still ambiguous and agnostic. What Lacoste assumes, however, and this puts a certain check to this interpretation of St. Theophan, is that Heidegger's interpretations of the anxiousness and recession of the world is in itself wholly accurate, and that it leaves us with the ineluctable horizon of being. Turning to Jean-Luc's Marian reading of Heidegger, this is not altogether obvious. We have, especially in the appeal to the nothing as the way towards the phenomenon of being, a certain failing. The search for attestation of being is not attained. Rather, what is attained is the anonymous call, never clearly forcing an ontological interpretation of itself as being, as anything, and thus in a certain way prior to being. We have the question then of the appearance of this nothing, which is at the very least irreducible to being, and is thus irreducible to any particular horizon. It's from this appearance transcendental I and of being, and secondly, the field to which this third reduction attains and attests to, that, quote, in whatever way and by whatever means something can relate to us, absolutely nothing is, happens, appears to us, or affects us that is not first, always, and obligatorily accomplished in the mode of a givenness, end quote. What this accomplishes phenomenologically is the description and analysis of phenomena without the necessity that they be fully inscribed within and according to the horizons of experience. Because of this, Theophan's words take on a new light. The experience of the vanity of the world does not bottom out at the horizon of being, and thus we need not understand this vanity within the confines of the hermeneutics of facticity. Indeterminate still, admittedly, is whether or not such an experience of nature accomplishes the same liturgical bracketing and the attendant opening onto the encounter with the absolute that Lacoste speaks of. Theophan clearly thinks this view of the tree to be spiritually salutary, but it is not yet clear whether the ambiguity and the interposition is overcome. It is clear, however, that something quite like a bracketing of world and earth attains in Marion's treatment. This third reduction to pure givenness is at the very least coextensive with Lacoste's liturgical subversion. For this reason, we must now consider the means by which this bracketing occurs. For Lacoste, the general tone of the discussion leans towards a decidedly volitional subversion of the play of experience, the claims that experience make upon us. Those who pray halt, choose, alter their being there into a being in vocation, thus play havoc without ever annulling their destined facticity. Liturgy is a work of freedom in a very strong sense. Now, in the case of Marion, this is by and large the same, especially when we look to his explicit discussions of prayer and liturgy. However, this reduction to givenness is not specially arrogated to liturgy, as we have already seen. What the reduction to givenness enables Marion to do is provide an analysis of varying grades of phenomenality, according to the relative fullness of intuition. The less that is given, the more fully our intention can manifest all there is to know about the phenomena. The privileged example is the simple logical or mathematical formula, where once one understands anything at all about it, one understands everything. A is identical to A, for example. Likewise with technologically manufactured repeatables. In their conceptualized blueprint, one sees everything at once. By contrast, there is the uncontroversial depth to any experience of what we could generally characterize as naively real things. Ipseity gives more to intuition than intention can contain. The extent to which this is either trivially or heretically Husserlian is an interesting debate, which I actually can't speak more on here. This excess of intuition, Marion terms saturation. It is these very saturated phenomena that particularly attest to givenness. Particularly strong instances of saturation, however, even more fully attest to this challenge to horizons by means of their appearance. Quote, certain phenomena could only appear by playing at the limits of phenomenality, indeed by making sport of them. End quote. Such phenomena include the general impossibility of getting the whole story about an event, even one so banal as a conference, temporality itself, the completely inescapable reality of my living sensibility. This is the absoluteness of living flesh that Marion takes up from Michel Henry, or the excessive quality of the face of the other, which Marion takes up from Levinas. This saturation of intuition, as was said, plays at and thus challenges horizons, which thus attests to givenness. That is as much to say, a reduction beyond the horizon of being occurs. It is often unexamined, perhaps obvious, as the passive nature of this occurrence of the reduction. All the same, it is clear that this excess of intuition is in some fashion attended to insofar as something is forced upon certain subjects. The experience of boredom, anxiety, the face, etc., are all hardly privileged domain of phenomenologists. Here stands as yet unnamed and yet clearly considered by Marion the instance of the passive reduction, wherein the bracketing is accomplished on the part of the phenomenon and not in volition of the subject. The impossibility of fully attaining to the givenness of the phenomenon on the basis of how much the given gives brackets the intentional horizons. For this reason, of course, we're still beyond the bounds of claiming that this occurs in the realm of vulgar and incontestable experience. But this is not, of course, to insist on total invisibility, as any reading of Marion's various analyses of saturated phenomena will make clear. Plenty is initially given to ordinary perception. but it is because of the play against the horizons of experience that the saturated phenomena is thus irreducible to the conditions of experience. It is on the basis of this theory of saturated phenomena that allows us to take up a somewhat altered consideration of the bracketing which liturgy accomplishes, and by this make way again to consider non-human nature. Let us take up the thoughts of Pavel Florensky, who himself is no quick admirer of purportedly spiritual experiences. In contrast to Lacoste's criticism of religious experience, wherein what is actually seen and heard offers far too little of the absolute, thanks to the penury of the divine in the horizons of our experience. For Florensky, the horizons of our ordinary life offer far too much in the way of the purportedly spiritual. The danger, rather than a forgetting or willful ignorance of the pall of death across our present life, is rather the danger of spiritual pride. Prelest is termed prelest in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. The great accumulation of psychological, social, and aesthetic material provides far too much fodder for the imagination, material with which to conjure up sights and visions of the purportedly eternal and divine. These not only interpose, but counterfeit the encounter of humanity with the absolute. All the same, the demand for the bracketing of these life worlds, of the horizons of the day-to-day, is just as direly called for. And just the same, Florensky thinks through this very same bracketing, under yet another figure. Quote, a day of spiritual sobriety, when it holds our soul and its power so sharply different from the spiritual realm that it cannot even pretend to be seductive, and its materiality is experienced not only as a burden, but also as a yoke, good for us in the way of considering gravity is good for earth. A yoke restricting our movements by giving us a yoke. A yoke creating in the streets, non-human and dethrones and destabilizes, places under its yoke, the self. And this in the same fashion as does the saturated phenomena give rise to the totally constituted power of the subject. And this check is itself located in the liturgy, which Florensky makes clear attains its, quote, way of ascent, unquote, precisely within time-space. This very ascent is that to the invisible world of spirit, and with that yet again we can affirm Lacoste's insistence that no incontestable advent, no unquestionably obvious experience occurs. It's invisible. There's no claim to it being seen. But it is by means of the church bedecked and formed and made possible by the very presence of the incontestably visible Christ, the iconostasis in particular, to say, these which we saw upstairs at the columns, the separation of the altar space from the rest of the day. The iconostasis is, of course, would and separates the clergy from the laity most of the time. But like any other saturated phenomena, it is irreducible to this common experience. Quote, quoting Florensky, in actuality, the iconostasis is a boundary between the visible and invisible worlds. It functions as a boundary by being an obstacle to our seeing the altar, thereby making it accessible to our consciousness by means of its unified row of saints. As our saints speak, there are some various people who appear to prepare us with visual strength for our spiritual roadways. Heavenly visions on the iconostasis, vivid, precise, and illuminated. Materially coherent and images of fixed colors. But this spiritual crop, this material iconostasis, does not conceal from the believer some sharp mystery. Destroy the material iconostasis, and the altar itself will, as such, fully vanish from our consciousness. That is to say, the very stuff of nature, wood, gold, fire, is taken out into the altar, creating the very possibility of bracketing our altar in the other world. This utterly material, utterly real stuff of liturgy acts in the liturgy, lifting in the place of our earthly inheritance to accomplish this bracketing, this day of spiritual sobriety, such that the spiritual accession, which cannot be simply gazed at, instead comes through and lives itself. That is to say, very much against Lacoste, that the real is not contested in liturgy, but is instead included and taken up. As we can see, the critique of experience, while only valid, as especially with regard to the ordinary lived experience of walking about and getting things done in the world, not filled with the spirit, which is still itself subject to history, and worse, to our particular history, requires some great deal of nuance. But with regard to the cause same, a possible critique still stands. Fine, one could say experience can bracket experience. But does not this new focus of attention upon the stuff of the world, all of nature's beauty, or the beauty particularly manifested in the material of the icons and other sacred objects, however much it might provide an escape, does that by necessity assume that the divine still makes its way through? Could not liturgy and cult, focused upon time-space experience, instead become just as much of an interposition? Who's to say that the absolute is actually encountered in this new natural bracketing? It is here, it must be admitted, that the going becomes rather complicated, and here I must confess that this is still a work in progress. The question turns about the simple dispute as to whether or not phenomenologically reduced nature speaks of God unambiguously or not. A way of avoiding a too neat conclusion at the expense of either simply making up stories or giving bad answers, let me enumerate instead some of the points of contention. It is of course the case that Lacoste is by and large correct about the theological penury of our ordinary experiences of the real. But the hope would be that at the far end of the reduction, perhaps something else could be found. The long tradition of orthodox mystical theology has it in effect that part and parcel to the heights of asceticism and sanctification include the love of all nature, simultaneously attending to them with a tender heart and a perfect understanding of the essence of all things, which is coextensive or even included in the vision of God. Florensky, along with his contemporary Sergei Bulgakov, both leapt upon this possibility within their rigorously orthodox interpretation of Solovyev's sophiology. Sophia, God's creating wisdom, the dynamic interplay of the second and third persons of the Trinity in their living creation of the world, is thus the all-integral existence of nature in its beauty. Sophia is, quote, the eternal bride of the Word of God, existing before the world, the church in its heavenly aspect, the true whole and incorruptible aspect of creaturely being, end quote, that is revealed to the ascetic. Quote, the primordial root of a person is perceived through the heart, and through this root a living link is established with the mother of the spiritual person, with Sophia, understood as the guardian angel of all creation consubstantial in love, received through Sophia from the Spirit, end quote. So in the saturated experience of things, reduced beyond horizons to their pure obscenity, God is in fact manifested, and so the interposition Lacoste fears is truly not a problem. From this theological claim, we can at least make the phenomenological suggestion that it is not so much that the transcendental horizons of experience which interpose and dismantle the experience of God. It is not so much that the transcendental horizons of experience interpose and dismantle the experience of God, but instead the fundamental matter of their contingent attunement. The ascetic who sees God in every branch and stone and candle clearly sees these things, but is also made privy to the symbolic surplus. On this basis, we can return to the question I mentioned at the beginning: how far the specifically liturgical extends. That is to say, we bring together two considerations already mentioned. First, it seems that anything in its obscenity can, of course, accomplish a certain kind of bracketing, but this is especially located in the incorporation of the stuff of nature into the material elements of the liturgy. But on the far side of this bracketing, at least under the hermeneutic of the legitimating theology, the spectacle of all integral nature comes through, which thus holds out the possibility, again, of a sort of natural theology on the back end of the ascetical endeavor. Since the bracketing that liturgy accomplishes is at least part and parcel of asceticism, and it is hard to miss the ascetical dimension in Florensky's insistence on sobriety in the liturgy, we seem to be able, perhaps by a leap, to bring together these two into a unified field. If liturgy is this bracketing, then there is, in a sense, a general and a special liturgy. The first, the already nascent spiritual quality of life in nature, obscure though it may be. The second, special liturgy, is the special cultic transformation of the natural, such that the alteration is focused, and thus makes clear this spiritual accession of the bounds of ordinary experience. The big S sacraments of the Church teach the possibility, although the training and seeing, the generally sacramental possibility of all experience. Recall Florensky's image of the iconostasis as a spiritual prop, an aid. It is for the sake of the multitude still in the process of their ascetical work, as it allows this opening onto the general liturgy, which is earthly life itself. The equivocal nature of this appeal to the general liturgy shouldn't be passed over too quickly, for it is both the bracketing of horizons, which has been our operating definition so far, and the teaching of the nature of the work, the actual meaning of the term liturgy, of humanity on earth, which is the sacramental operation according to Christian theology. It is difficult in this account, however, and this is, as I've said, a very strong difficulty for me, is that this critique begins with a claim that is already theological and metaphysical to the core. A legitimating hermeneutic is standing and already in place long before any of this can be attained to, which renders as a secondary fact that which one would hope to be considered a primary datum. Both Marian and Lacoste agree on this. God must be named as creator before we can hear creation sing his praises. And this should come as little surprise. In Marian's treatment of revelation as saturated phenomena, the eventual furthest edge of the reduction actually collapses into theology. To bracket every name of God is to enter into a new pragmatic relationship with God, which Marian quite boldly describes as an induction to God's horizon. A new hermeneutic is given in this moment of almost wondrous theological empiricism. When our horizons fail, if we persist in the attempt at the encounter a new horizon is given us, this is not all too different from Florensky, and it is appropriate that in Florensky's discussion of the icon, he takes great pains to make clear that the person depicted in the icon is made present, and in the passive reduction before the face of this sanctified other, the saint teaches us. Marian's discussion of the tradition of apathetic theology, however, does not make clear the connections to any sort of preparatory or ascetical labor, and he has been criticized precisely for this deficiency. As it stands, we likewise have the difficulty that Florensky's own treatment of asceticism, in keeping with his Eastern Orthodox tradition, is wrapped up within a strongly interpreted theological anthropology, one that makes easy translation into phenomenological investigation difficult, or at least this is my own experience. The shared insistence upon the necessity of the reduction of the spuriously egoistic or worldly horizons of everyday experience do provide a beginning, of course, but to my knowledge, with the partial exceptions of Sartre and Henri, a phenomenological martyrology has remained a sharp lacuna within phenomenology's theological turn. I have nothing more of use to say about that. Turning an eye towards sophiology again, it is likewise not at all clear to me that integral nature can be considered a phenomenological datum. As such, an appeal to the awaiting Mother Nature, the veiled Isis, in order for it later to be revealed in the light of God's given hermeneutic as Sophia, is difficult to swallow. For if we believe Florensky's own genealogy of the idea of integral nature, and this has been corroborated by other scholars as far as I know, integral nature does not itself appear at the dawn of experience. Law-like nature, the undergirding stability for the natural sciences, for example, appears with the advent of monotheism, at the very least, if not Christianity particularly. So again, this already has to be theologically legitimated. What is lacking, or what I'm looking for, is the nascent possibility within phenomenology to actually accede to an opening onto these theological theses. And it has occurred to me on the basis of all this talk yesterday that my beginning with the assumption of a transcendent extra-human nature might be part of the problem. Perhaps an examination of Michel Henri's phenomenology will aid in attending to such an impasse. Thank you.
Please, questions. We are open for questions. Questions?
No, I've I want to, when you were talking, you were talking about liturgy and bracketing of the worldly, right? I had an association, I have no idea its value, but I remember reading a book called After Writing by Catherine Pickstock.
Okay.
She's one of these associated with radical orthodoxy.
Okay.
And she talks about liturgy in a way in which it's, if I'm not mistaken, she talks about it as kind of like action of two levels simultaneously. The temporal and also the eternal. So there's something acting beyond what's going on literally.
Right.
And she refers that to a specific kind of structure, you know, time and space. Does that resonate at all with what you're doing?
Yeah, it does, as a matter of fact. I mean, it's the fact that Lacoste has made such a strong claim that the only interpretation of what goes on in liturgy bottoms out as non-experience and non-event, which he goes to great lengths to analyze, by virtue of the fact that that Christian theology is still waiting for the Perusia of the second coming of Christ. Really gives far too much of a lie to the ordinary bounds of experience, and so the importance of temporality in that, for example, is another way of getting at what I'm trying to do. So the inclusion of that two level, the temporal and the eternal, by recognizing the temporal as opposed to bracketing out just as something that is only seen negatively in the case of Lacoste, does point along in sort of the direction that I'm hoping to take this. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I almost certainly have misunderstood what you've said, but given that, you've heard the expression about the hound of heaven? Yes. Well, I was curious about your idea that induction might not be enough to get you to revelation. But is that ever necessary? Is that ever the case, that induction is all you have? Given that religious experience is supposed to be revelatory.
Right.
So that you don't need to claw and scratch your way there by induction.
Right. The Jean-Luc Marien's analysis of the phenomena of revelation, what that could possibly mean as phenomenological data, happens on the basis of the phenomenological reduction to the fold of givenness. So it's not a scratching upward of in your appealing to induction, you mean something along the metaphysical inductive argument to probabilities, right?
Yes, trying to.
Okay, yes, that
build your.
That's actually just not what's being talked about, unfortunately. So fortunately, no, you don't have to claw your way up from the barest individual bits of evidence.
Nor is it true that nor could you do that through an icon.
Right.
Nor
no.
could you analyze your way to heaven through an icon.
Yeah. No, the only thing that's really given, for example, in an icon without any sort of theological interpretation being provided by a tradition, by a given hermeneutic, is just its irreducibility to being a three-dimensional object. This already occurs, as we have talked about, in aesthetic works, photographs even. So that kind of empiricism, no, is not what's being talked about or appealed to.
Your talk for me resonated in very many different levels, of course, but what I remember is the kind of historically recorded reason in Russian theological discourse as to why Christianity was introduced to Russia. Russia was introduced to Christianity. And the story was that the prince of the time, Vladimir, the ruler of southern Russia, was looking for faith which would allow to unify all those different kingdoms and faiths and pagan cults which on the territory of Russia in the 10th century could not provide enough unity to resist the Tatar Mongol upcoming conquest and or threatening conquest. And so he sent emissaries to different neighborhood provinces, including Byzantium. And when they attended liturgy in Hagia Sophia, they wrote the following report that they say, we couldn't realize whether we are in heaven or on earth because of the transfixing quality of the ritual. And it is indeed, it's a highly symbolical environment. And with all the chants and frescoes, images, visual images, special kind of architecture which is supposed to affect the body sense. And I must say the icons, they do produce some kind of in those who contemplate them, a sense of continuity, of the tangible continuity of space, what Christians call energies. And then again, for Orthodoxy, energies are non-created, so all the Platonic emanations will be considered not emanation of God, but God himself. So that account, I think, exactly plays into what you are conveying. In communist Russia, this was interpreted as a reference to the beauty of the ritual. But I think that there is much more than beauty, and that's why I tried to convey that there is sort of like parallel or it's not a part of madness like it appears in phenomenological investigations. It's sort of like a parallel flow of experience, but it never occurred to me to qualify it really as an experience. It's certainly the other, but you put it as not God's consciousness, in the sense it's disowned intentionality, but it makes itself fully available or disowned materiality. Your country.
Absolutely. What's important, likewise, is that this, at least within Orthodox theology, the legitimation of theology itself is based upon the same sort of experience. The point of the veracity of the church councils with regard to dogmatic definitions are that the people that ascertain the dogmatic definitions themselves have witnessed God in this fashion. Which is to say that the experience is supposed to provide this new hermeneutic of life that is on the basis of revelation and is not just this protection of numinous states. So it's content-full, and it's explicit, and it's contentful that doesn't force and I don't want to say too much on this insofar as I'll probably get myself into trouble and say things I don't actually think true. I don't really trust myself on the extemporaneous description of these things. So the point is that the experience has content, or at least generates a kind of content, that it really can actually, there's a contiguity of experience in spite of its otherworldly character, which is in contradiction to what is frankly an iconoclastic tendency in Lacoste's analysis of liturgy.
How do you see the continuity? Continuity of what?
Right.
And there is ipseity of some kind.
Yes, the ipseity is meant to force a certain kind of reduction. The particular ipseity of the materiality of the church worship it occurs to me that I haven't really worked out what exactly makes that special, other than it's already theologically based content. So phenomenologically, I haven't looked at a differentiation to that. And I don't have anything to say about it at the moment. As I've said, this is still a work in progress. And this is highlighting something that's been obscured so far. So thank you.
On martyrology, theological, there may be something in Stein, because
Okay.
I also read Stein, when she was taken to concentration camp. There was something that she said in terms of I'm going to join my people, because I'm not sure, but there is a sense of going into martyrdom.
Ideally, anyway, the beauty of the liturgy, and in fact, in the early church, it was ideally this reflection of what was happening. Jesus celebrating liturgy in the presence of the Trinity and the communion of saints. So, but given the beauty of the liturgy, did you find anything in your research, given at least my own belief that preaching is an integral part of that? Did you, as you mentioned preaching at one point,
Right.
did you find anything in your
That has also been
research?
skipped over. I'll admit that this paper is a product of a matter of weeks of work. So as I said, there's a very work in progress. It's a nascent project, but it's really the impetus was an opening of this debate with Lacoste, and that I've seen his name turn up rather frequently, particularly with Protestant phenomenologists who understandably have something of a different axiology with regards to the experiential role in this particular fashion. So, on the perspective, the aspect of preaching, specifically the in Saint Theophan, the fact that it is the spoken word of the priest in the liturgy accounts of a special phenomenological veracity. It actually touches the heart. And I know that Michel Henry has this complicated or sort of counter phenomenology of language, which is in addition to the semiotic web of signifiers that accounts for our ordinary spoken language that could partially account for that. Unfortunately, I don't know much more about that. So in that regard, this is another clearly important thing to look into, and so you bring it up is very helpful.
Just a recommendation. I don't know if you have come across the work of Jean-Louis Chrétien.
I've heard the name.
But his perspective, I think, is refreshing, particularly on issues of language, the linguistic component of liturgy. Anyhow, he also has an interesting point. He brings into phenomenological discourse the Thomistic thesis, Platonist thesis of the reditus, right?
Oh, really?
So we return to God in the eschaton, but nature does not. The material order does not. It only returns as the correlate of our acts of thought. So nature returns to God, not itself as materially, but as the object of our praising God, of our speaking to God in an eschaton. And it is there, in a verbal, eschatological way, that the nature comes into its own. So,
Interesting.
anyhow, I don't know. If you had heard about that or read about that, I would have asked you about the
Briefly.
intersection between what you have mentioned regarding the natural in Lacoste. and
That is definitely
very critical.
important. Definitely important. Like I said, this has come from a very small bit of research that your recommendations are extremely helpful in this regard, and that I knew that I was coming up against a wall with regards to working with Marion, and it's been very unsatisfying. But as of yet, I haven't been able to move on to other approaches.
Just came to my mind, it's perhaps connected also with your last idea. But I had to think about Teilhard-de-Chardin's experience with the matter, like mystical experience with the matter.
Okay.
One of his texts, it's a very small chapter, it's very personal for him. And I think it's even called liturgy.
Okay.
And it's a liturgy he was experiencing with nature. That's his idea of extended incarnation. And body of Christ was the world. And it was kind of very strong or heavy or
Right.
very rich text in many ways.
It's good. That something similar to that is briefly hinted at in the appeal to the sophiological developments of Florensky and Bulgakov, which, as I had said before, these are very powerful and interesting theological ideas, but I'm not at all certain how to legitimate that in some sort of phenomenological fashion. Much the same, I've found much the same in Chardin and Bergson, for that matter. There's a leap into theological interpretations that is almost proud of that leap, that it can only be attained to by faith, and yet faith itself is not quite so demanding upon consciousnesses. So when I leap to that particular faith, into the faith of this particular theological interpretation, there's nothing guaranteeing someone else is attaining to that same point, which is the problem that I'm encountering quite strongly. The legitimation of these particularly theological interpretations of experience.
We're at time now.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.